Today we have some more actual history about the early days of the American Republic. We will be reading an account of Tecumseh's life that is not accepted by our so-called modern historians. This account makes the provocative claim that Tecumseh's mother was a white captive. We will be reading from the October 1948 issue of the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, an article written by George Harman Bayles titled, Tecumseh and the Bayless Family Tradition. According to the author, Tecumseh was his first cousin twice removed, the daughter of his great-grand-aunt Mary Bayles. In this article, he presents the family tradition that he heard, as well as other evidence he had gathered to support this story. Before I read this story, I am now going to read part of this editor's notes about the author George Bayles. George Harman Bayles is the son of Jonah Bayles. He was born on September 19, 1877, near Isis Ferry, about 7 miles from Morgantown, West Virginia. A brief and incomplete biography of Mr. Bayles follows. Degree of BSCE, West Virginia University, 1902. Honorary member of Tau Beta Pi Engineering Honorary Society. 1913 member of the American Society of Civil Engineers. National Geographic Society. Associate member of American Museum of Natural History, Travelers Club, New York, Circumnavigators Club, New York. Mr. Bayles has worked in 35 West Virginia counties and in 9 foreign countries. He has served for several terms as city manager of Morgantown. So as you can see, George Bayles was an accomplished citizen of West Virginia. He did not appear to have any motive for fabricating this story. So here is the story of Tecumseh and the Bayless family tradition. A few years ago, while reading accounts of pioneer settlements west of the Alleghenies, I was surprised to discover what seemed to be almost complete lack of information concerning the parentage and early life of Tecumseh. Since we had a family tradition about him, if a story so recent and near to first hand can be called a tradition, I read all accounts I could find, and discovered amazing disparities in them. While none was the same and some varied greatly from it, there was much written that corroborated our story, and nothing authentic that was really contrary to it. Before giving our tradition, I shall outline what others have said about Tecumseh, his age, description, parentage, place of birth. According to Draper, Tecumseh was born in 1768, and this is the date given by most historians and biographers, all based on Draper's statement. And Draper got his information from an old man who said he and Tecumseh played together as boys, when both were about 12 years of age, and that he was born in 1768. There is also a story that his father was killed in the Battle of Point Pleasant in 1774. It, too, is widely accepted, though no writer gives his authority. His father is said by these writers to have been a Shawnee chief, named Pekashinawa, but Cornstalk led the Shawnees in that battle, and Roosevelt says no important chief was slain there. On the other hand, Colonel Hatch, who knew him personally, said that when he saw him last on August 17, 1812, he was then in the prime of his life. Green says Tecumseh was born about 1776. Captain Glegg, aide to General Brock, writing in August 1812, said his age I imagine to be about 35. Sabani, a Potawatomi, said he was still a young man at the time of his death. Hatch, speaking of him in 1806, says he was an almost invariable winner in athletic games and sports. Zeisberger, a missionary, who traveled throughout Ohio and Indiana, and kept a complete diary from 1791 to 1798, does not mention him. And Charles Johnston, who was a captive of the Indians for 4 weeks in 1790, and was taken by him from the Ohio to Lake Erie, also does not mention him. Finally, the Encyclopedia Britannica puts the date of his birth as from 1768 to 1780. So it is evident that the date is a doubtful one with the historians, with the testimony of all who wrote down their impressions at the time of seeing him, indicating that he was younger than historians generally have assumed. The place of his birth is almost as uncertain as his age. One says he was born on Hacker's Creek, another on Mad River, still another in Chillicothe, rather old Chillicothe. One writer, Doddridge, says, Chillicothe means only the old campsite. Many stories grew up about his early life, as they did about Washington and every other prominent person, and in the main seem to be apocryphal. The story that he fled in a fight in 1786, that he and 10 others were attacked by Robert McClellan and about 30 others in December of 1792 and defeated them. The story written down 45 years after the event from hearsay that he took part in a massacre on Hackers Creek in 1792, that he and 6 others, encumbered with their women, defeated an attack by Simon Kenton and 33 other men in 1793, that he scouted against Wayne in 1794, but did not take part in the fighting against him, nor in the treaty. All seem stories built up long after the event, partly stories in the nature of hero worship, and partly stories of the I knew him when kind, that attach to all noted persons. A man of his evident ability and known temperament would have been better known at the time cited if he had been born in 1768, and too young to have taken the parts assigned to him if born in 1776, with the exception perhaps of the story of scouting Wayne in 1794, a task a boy might do while still too young for a war or council. The first record of him written at the time is of his appearance at the Council of Urbana in 1799, where the interpreter, one Tecumseh, speaks of his eloquence and of his own inability to translate it into equivalent English. This may have been the Tecumseh who ransomed Charles Johnston, above referred to from the Indians in 1790. The first record of Tecumseh's official communication with the whites was in 1807, according to Raymond, but from 1803 on there were increasingly numerous accounts of his appearance, and by 1805 he had attained sufficient standing among the Indians to be invited to come to their village at Au Glaize to live, practically an invitation to become their chief. Armstrong says that in 1805, on his way to accept this invitation, Tecumseh stopped at Greenville where an extraordinary character was then living, called the Prophet. There are many stories extant as to Tecumseh's relationship to the Prophet. Hatch quotes Simon Kenton as saying that Tecumseh, the Prophet, and another Indian were triplets. Later Hatch says Tecumseh and the Prophet were twins, and several biographers copy this as a fact. Knowing the fixed belief of the Indians in the supernatural power of twins, and much more of triplets, it is possible that these men, if they did not foster the stories, at least made no effort to deny them. Raymond says Tecumseh was born in 1768, accepting Draper's story, and the Prophet in 1775, but later he says the Prophet appeared much older than his distinguished brother. Beard says Tecumseh was born in 1768, and the Prophet in 1771. Sabini says Elskatawa, the Prophet, was Tecumseh's older brother. Armstrong's statement mentioned above indicates a first meeting of them in 1805. Various writers comment on the marked dissimilarity of the two men in appearance, not a common characteristic of twins. From all these statements and their discrepancies, it may be properly doubted that there was any close blood relationship between these two men, whose activities were so closely joined for several years, but only a religio-political association, in which each saw an advantage to himself and to the success of his plans in joining the other. Tecumseh was referred to in official communications by government officers as the Prophet's brother, instead of by name as late as 1810, a thing hardly likely if they had been the same age. Biographers usually speak of Tecumseh as a full-blooded Shawnee Indian, having no definite evidence to the contrary, but all comment on and marvel at his qualities of a high type of white man. They mention a story said to have come from the Indians that his grandmother was the daughter of a governor of South Carolina, whom her father gave to an Indian he admired. Besides there being no record in South Carolina of such an occurrence, the story falls by its own weight of improbability, and is rejected by all biographers. But the descriptions of Tecumseh, written at the time of seeing and knowing him by several careful observers, all seem to point to the conclusion that he must have been of mixed blood. For example, Colonel Hatch, his height was about 5 feet 9 inches, his face oval rather than angular, his nose handsome and straight, his mouth beautifully formed, like that of Napoleon I, as represented in his portraits, his eyes clear and transparent hazel, with a mild, pleasant expression when in repose, or in conversation, but when excited in his orations, or by enthusiasm of conflict, or when in anger they appeared like balls of fire. his teeth beautifully white, his complexion more of a light brown or tan than red. Captain Glegg, writing in August of 1812, said his complexion is light copper, countenance oval, with bright hazel eyes beaming cheerfulness, energy, and decision. Indians do not have oval faces or hazel eyes. C.B. Galbraith quotes a story by a writer living in Oklahoma about a little girl stolen from the English settlements who is adopted by the wife of a chief, and ends up, that little English girl was the great-grandmother of Thomas Wildcat Alford. Mr. Alford is the great-grandson of Tecumseh. If one generation were added, that little girl would have been Tecumseh's mother. Some biographers say Tecumseh spoke no English. Hatch says he did understand and could speak nearly all the words in common use, sufficiently to hold conversation on ordinary topics, but he never spoke in any but his own language at a council, or when in the presence of any officer or agent of any government. W.A. Galloway mentions the use of excellent English, which distinguished Tecumseh's eloquent war and peace orations. Having discovered all these discrepancies and seeing the lack of definite information concerning the early life of this chief, I thought it might not be amiss to make public our family tradition or story, for whatever ends it may properly serve in establishing his correct place in history. For after all, though his own names came to naught, he did play an important part in life of the frontier in the early part of the 19th century. Jesse Bayless and his wife, Marie Monrain, and their young children came from the vicinity of Winchester in the Shenandoah Valley to settle near Isis Ferry in 1770. Their second child and eldest daughter Mary, born in 1763, was stolen by the Indians and returned years later with a 2-year-old son, whom she called Tecumseh. She said he was born in the Indian camp on Quarry Run, about 2 miles from Isis Ferry. Mary later, in 1782, married Andrew Ice, but kept Tecumseh with her until he was 14 years of age. He then went to join his father's people, and gradually rose to be a great chief. He often visited his home during these years, where he was considered one of the family, and was always on the friendliest terms with his mother's people and their neighbors. The night before the battle in which he lost his life, he and 2 of his half-brothers, Jesse and John Ice, soldiers in the American Army, sat on the trunk of a fallen tree and visited for some time. That is the story as we have it. My grandfather was Tecumseh's first cousin. My father was his first cousin once removed. So while there is no scrap of documentary evidence to support the story, it is too nearly contemporary to be discarded or even to be called a tradition. It is only of yesterday or the day before at most. Since Mary Bayles was born in 1763 and married Andrew Ice in 1782, it seems most likely that Tecumseh was born in 1779 or 1780, a date which corresponds closely enough with the estimates of his age by competent observers, as mentioned above. My father's uncle John Bayles, born in 1801 or 1802, Tecumseh's first cousin, remembered him well, and often told my father stories about him. My hazy recollection is that he told them to me too, but I was only 14 when he died, and did not pay sufficient attention to be sure now. But a very early recollection of mine is of my father telling us one day, as we went up to Quarry Run, that Tecumseh was born right around there. For years I had the idea that he was born in one of the little houses, then standing at Henry Clay Furnace, which we were passing when he told us the story. However, they were not built until about 1833. A more recent confirmation of the story came through a visit my father paid to Buffalo in 1905. One day, with others, he visited Niagara Falls, and there saw numbers of Indians displaying their wares for sale. One who said he was a Salamanca Indian told my father that his great-grandmother was a white captive girl from Morgantown called Jemison, or Jameson. When he learned my father's name, he said his great-grandfather's particular friend had a white captive wife by that name, and their son was the great chief Tecumseh. This Indian said Tecumseh was born in the Indian camp under the rock ledges in the fork of Quarry Run, about a mile from the river, and described it as a place where huge fragments of rock projected from the hillside, and some extended out above the ground, forming a shelter for the camp. He said he had never been in this country, but gave a reasonably close description of a trail crossing the Monongahela, near Point Marion, crossing the Cheat a little higher up, going over Cheat Neck up the river past Isis Ferry to where Mont Chateau now stands, leaving the river and following a bench around the hillside to and across Quarry Run, just above the fork, and then up the hill to the rock camp. From the camp, the trail continued, he said, across the mountain glades of Sandy Creek, Briery Mountains, and on south and east across the range. I had never seen the rocks described by the Salamancan, so one day late in October 1933, my father, my brother, my two sisters, and I drove to where the pike crosses Quarry, and my brother and I walked down along the run to near the fork. There we found just such rocks as the Indian had described, such as no doubt all of you have seen in Rock City, near Painter Rock, or Cooper's Rock Park. We saw no evidence of a camp other than the rocks, nor did we find any artifacts, but we should remember that 100 years ago that region was well developed industrially, and a thriving village stood only a mile from this site. Several writers give Tecumseh's birthplace as Chillicothe. Since the word means campgrounds, it might just as well be the campground on Quarry Run as some other campground in Ohio. A curious check on the old Salamancan story of his own ancestry appeared in the newspapers a few years ago. At a court trial in western New York, an Indian woman appeared whose name was given as Jimerson. Indians carry on the mother's name as the family name. Jameson was pronounced Jimison by old-timers. Since writing the above, the following has come to my attention. On August 20th, 1946, Mr. N.F. Kendall, historian and genealogist of Grafton, West Virginia, wrote me quoting from some old family records. He said in part, Jeremiah Kendall, born 1758, died 1843, an Indian scout and frontier ranger, was a great-uncle of my grandfather Elias Kendall. Jeremiah and his son, General William Kendall, both knew Tecumseh well, and associated with him quite a lot. Jeremiah Kendall left in his papers many personal memoirs, some of which his nephew Reverend William Kendall, my great-grandfather, copied, and later my father, W.B.C. Kendall, also made copies. This one on Tecumseh. Being an Indian ranger on frontier guard duty along the upper Ohio, I had on at least 11 different occasions to meet in conference with a Shawnee Indian chief, before and after his appointment as chief, on grievances between whites and Indians. He always wanted to be a friend of the whites so long as the whites would deal fairly with them. To me he was always anxious to make agreements, and he always observed them. His mother was a white girl, captured by Indians when about 10 or 11 years of age. A Mr. Ice told me she was captured on Buffalo Creek. Tecumseh says she was taken near Isis Ferry, and her name was Mary Bayles, and when about 15 years of age, she was compelled to marry my father, who wanted a son by a white woman. My father had 2 other Indian wives. While my father was away at war, my mother and myself were exchanged for 2 Indian women and 3 Indian men. On his return he was very mad. When he was told that he could visit his son any time he wanted to, and be a friend to my mother's people, this pleased him. A second Kendall note says, Tecumseh informs me that his father and his half-brothers and sisters, who were full-blooded Indians, visited him many times at Isis Ferry, which he says was not far from my birthplace. He says I visited them at their home where Springfield, Ohio is, about 4 times, and they always brought me back to Mother. A third Kendall note says, I asked Tecumseh why his father compelled this white girl to marry him. He answered, Good Indians never have children out of wedlock, must be married. I also asked if his father thought well of his white wife. Tecumseh answered, Yes, she was no slave. She was his favorite squaw. He planned that she should head a new clan and tribe. He treated her with great kindness. Mr. Ice informed me that Mary Bayles never had an unkind word for her Indian friends. There is much more to Mr. Kendall's letter, but these are the quotations bearing on Tecumseh's ancestry. The facts of Tecumseh's life are too well known for me to go into them here and now, but it might not be amiss for me to give a brief sketch of it as we see it in light of this story. Tecumseh was born in 1779 in a camp in the forks of Quarry Run, about a mile from its mouth. His father was an Indian chief and his mother was Mary Bayles, a white captive. His mother escaped or was ransomed from the Indians and returned to her home when he was 2 years old, bringing him with her. She married Andrew Ice in 1782, and Tecumseh continued to live with them at Isis Ferry till he was 14 years old. He then returned to the Indians. His position as a half-breed among whites may by then have become a difficult one, but the teachings and customs of white men were well ingrained into his character. While at Isis Ferry, he must have seen General Washington when he crossed there in 1784, as well as the great Methodist missionary and pulpit orator, Asbury, when he preached there the same year. Practical cessation of Indian atrocities along the frontier is generally credited to General Wayne's victory at Fallen Timbers in 1794, but Tecumseh's well-known humanity, as shown on many later occasions, may well have been the influence that controlled the roving bands. It was about 1793 that he left Isis Ferry and rejoined the Indians. He became a firm and almost fanatical opponent of white aggression on Indian lands, and failing to get any satisfaction from General Harrison, then governor of that region, he joined the British, became a brigadier general in their army, and was the strongest force fighting against the Americans in the land battles of the War of 1812. His stubborn determination to fight it out instead of running away brought on the Battle of the Thames, where he was killed in the fight. His body was never seen again by white men, and his burial place has never been discovered or divulged. Accounts of the time of the turn of the century, 1790 to 1813, are filled with stories of hope and despair, gaiety and horror, tragedy and farce, happy celebrations and dogged trailings of savage marauders, the discovery of the mutilated forms of white women and children along the trail or in the homes, and the terrible revenge of their menfolks. It was among such conditions as these that Tecumseh was born and lived and died, and which his firm character and powerful authority did so much to ameliorate. So that is it for the Bayless family story of Tecumseh, and his birth by a white mother named Mary Bayles around 1780. Tecumseh's return to the Indians in 1794 coincided with a longer period of peace between the Americans and the Shawnee that lasted until the Battle of Tippecanoe in 1811. This article suggests that Tecumseh may have played a critical role in maintaining peace for about 17 years, perhaps because of his familiarity with the white settlers from growing up with his mother. The relationship between Tecumseh and the prophet is still unclear. Different accounts claim they were brothers, twins, or triplets. I think it's possible that the prophet was his older half-brother through Tecumseh's father, perhaps with one of the two other wives that the story mentioned that his father had. There is also another slightly different story about Tecumseh's mother, which says that she was the sister of Indian Billy Ice, who was the half-brother of Mary Bayles' husband, Andrew Ice. Indian Billy was 27 years older than his half-brother Andrew, and he was captured by Indians around 1745. I will now read this section from a blog post at historyandnovelty.com that tells a little bit more about Indian Billy Ice. William Galloway Ice was born the second son of Frederick Ice and Mary Galloway on the 1st of April in 1730. The family was living in the South Branch of the Potomac River in Patterson Creek, Hampshire County, Virginia. This area would later become part of West Virginia. William was also a colorful character and the father of most of the modern-day Ice families in the United States, mostly because he was the father of 17 children with 3 different wives. After a year with a remarkably good crop, when William was about 10 years old, Frederick Ice and several of the men of the town went to the mill. They had a long distance to go, probably to Winchester, Virginia, which at the time was a center of trade for northeastern Virginia. When they returned to the settlements, they found the Mohawk Indians had raided it, and killed or taken the inhabitants, burned the homes, destroyed the crops, and driven off the livestock. Frederick found within the ashes of his home his wife Mary, and 3 of his children were captured by the Indians. These children were Christine, William, and Mary. Mary stayed the remainder of her life with this Indian tribe, and only visited the Ice family once afterward, in 1825. Although untrue, she is mentioned in several places as the mother of Tecumseh. Christina married an Indian, had 3 children with him, and died naturally at age 25. The only member of Frederick's family to come home was William. During this time, William was sold to the Shawnee Indians. William tried to escape from the Native Americans several times, but was caught, brought back into the Ohio native towns, and the top of his ears were cut off flat for his attempts. These native towns are near modern-day Chillicothe, Ohio. In her book, Virginia Ice Conaway wrote about William's time at these native camps. I have heard my father, T.F. Conaway, tell how his granduncle Bill Ice, as they called him, escaped from the Indians. He, Indian Billy, said that the Indians were away out beyond the Ohio River, and once they started on a trail through the woods, took him and one of the young Indian boys along. Eventually they stopped and left most of their horses for him and this boy to take care of. He and the Indian boy got into a fight, and he got the best of the Indian in the fight. Then he went into the wigwam. I did not like the look the boy gave me, and decided to leave. The horses were together near camp, and I took a horse and followed the trail of the Indians who had left us, and in a few miles found myself opposite a town. I swam my horse across the river, and fastened it in the bushes and walked into Pittsburgh. A white man was sitting in the street, and asked me if I was a prisoner of the Indians. I said that I was. He told me that if you want to escape, go into the house, and stay until the Indians leave town. I will take care of you. I told this man where I left my horse. He gave me food and clothes to wear. I had worn Indian clothes while I was with them. I could talk English learned from other prisoners. I worked a while in Pittsburgh, then went to Canada, and stayed a while. From Canada I went to Paris, France, and then came back to America, landing in Philadelphia just as they were getting to cut the Mason and Dixon line. I joined and worked with them until I came to Isis Ferry. My stepmother was talking to one of the men who belonged to the camp, and he told her they had a man who had been with the Indians. She took me home, and Father found that Brother John was still with the Indians, and arranged to bring him home. So that was a short account of the captivity of William or Indian Billy Ice. He would go on to serve in the militia during both the French and Indian War and the United States Revolution. He was about 52 years old when his half-brother Andrew Ice married Mary Bayles, who had just returned from captivity with her 2-year-old son Tecumseh. As the story mentioned, Indian Billy Ice had a sister named Mary, who was captured by the Shawnee along with him in 1745, and was said to have lived with them for the rest of her life. This Mary Ice, not Mary Bayles Ice, was also said to be the mother of Tecumseh. As the story says, this account is probably not true, and the account may have confused the much older Mary Ice, captured in 1745, with Mary Bayles Ice, who was captured around 1775. If Indian Billy Ice's sister Mary was around the same age as him, then she would have been in her late 40s or early 50s by 1780, when Tecumseh was born. Indian Billy Ice and Mary Bayles's husband, Andrew Ice, were both sons of Frederick Ice, who was born in 1680 in Amsterdam, and educated in Germany before leaving for America in 1710, at the age of 30. His first wife and 2 children were killed in the 1745 raid, where Indian Billy and 2 of his sisters were captured. Frederick Ice started Isis Ferry in 1767, which crossed the Cheat River. George Washington used Isis Ferry to cross the river on a western surveying expedition in 1784. Frederick Ice lived to the age of 114. He died in 1794 after drowning in the Cheat River near his ferry. So that's it for this episode. Let us know what you think about Tecumseh's parentage in the comments. Do you believe the Bayless family history that Tecumseh's mother was a captive named Mary Bayles? Or do you believe the conventional view that Tecumseh was a full-blooded Shawnee Indian, born in 1768 in Chillicothe? This channel is called Unworthy History because we cover actual history that has been cast aside as unworthy by our modern historians. We try to read actual history directly from the source, or as close to it as possible. The purpose of this channel is to keep alive the history of people who lived difficult lives long ago, people whose shoes we are unworthy to stand in. If you'd like to support our mission here at Unworthy History, then please join our Patreon page or become a YouTube channel member for $5 per month. Members will have access to our members-only videos, and your contribution will be recognized at the end of each episode. For a limited time, all of our members-only videos are available for individual purchase for $3.25 on our channel's Patreon page at patreon.com/unworthyhistory. So if you want to see more episodes like this, then be sure to like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time on Unworthy History.